This week at the Globalising Men's Fashion Conference for the year 2020, I will be speaking with the fashion practitioner and interdisciplinary artist, LESIBA MABITSELA, about his latest body of work titled REINSTITUTE, wherein we discuss drapery, negative spaces and the importance of performance theory in fashion. I was fortunate enough to have taken part in his intervention at the ZEITZ Museum of Contemporary Art Africa in Cape Town on behalf of colonial institutions the world over, and am more than happy to bring this insightful conversation to you, our guests. Enjoy. Tell us then about REINSTITUTE and where it began.
The REINSTITUTE was looking at reversing those ideas of construction and using a lot of theory from Anne Hollander, who talks about drape. The woman's attire started to change with the times and started to change with the politics of the times as well. Men's garments particularly didn't change after the Victorian era, and if they changed ever so slightly. And I was looking at so many of the areas, the issues that influenced the creation of the suit, like old Roman ideas of empire, and how those are connected to the statues, and those statues, Greek Roman statues, were kind of connected to this idea of a healthy body, well-built body. And especially because I kind of saw this as a period in time that kind of where bodies were starting to be shaped by corsets. Even men wore corsets, and even the suit is a body sort of shaping sort of garment based on its how it's constructed. So a woman was constructed to look a particular way, and men were constructed to look a particular way. So construction has a double meaning in this work. I looked at how drape was used to kind of mark the deity, the Greek gods and so on and so forth. Interestingly enough, drapery in those cases either meant, had a sense of might, but at the same time, or rather, particularly for Jesus Christ, and Hollander speaks of how drapery was kind of used as a form of expressing vulnerability, because there's a sense you're revealing the male body. Philippa Levine, by the way, that talks about a idea of states of undress and kind of applied it to many other aspects of resistance. And one of them was there were three major accounts that I was looking at, was with the Seda Senghor. Then there was also Mohandas Gandhi and Nelson Mandela, who all three of them used performatively used aspects of undress, so taking off their suits and discarding them. In Gandhi's case for Khadi, which is the idea of self-sufficiency, but this was obviously in resistance to the British. Then you had Nelson Mandela in one case where he was being tried at the treason trial, and he decided not to attend in a suit to kind of make a political point about the law which is trying him is not the law which he recognizes. And so that performative act of him removing his suit was a form of defiance. And so I was looking at those elements. Collectively, I was kind of looking at also the Japanese influence on Western fashion, particularly the three designers who were known for deconstruction. So that's Issey Miyake, Rei Kawakubo, and Yohei Yamamoto. And particularly Yohei and I would say Rei Kawakubo's deconstruction of the common suit as a form of resistance, which, funny enough, if you look in history, and they won't say, according to Bonnie English, they don't necessarily equate that sort of history. They won't necessarily say that their designs are somewhat a connection to their Japanese heritage, but there was a a rebellion that took place in we would say just after Japan started to open up to the world. I want to say at the end of the Edo period. Um, and the samurai who were kind of the sons of the samurai, um, men or um, staged protests, performance like as well, political performances, and they used dress to kind of convey their distaste and dismay of a new Western cultural sort of order that was now being ushered into Japan. And they used aspects of dress such as frayed edges and ill-fitting garments, torn um, garments. So these were part of the This was part of the language that was used to make a point about where they stood within their politics at the time. And so I thought this would be an interesting sort of lens to work from.
Yes, I see that. The garments are rather drape heavy. Is there a particular reason for that?
So I worked with REINSTITUTE, and I wanted to make heavily draped garments. And it's interesting because I also looked into theories around Ma, which Issey Miyake talks about a lot when he was working with APOC. Bonnie English mentions in her book around Japanese designers that Ma is an actual ancient Chinese concept around composition, where there was more emphasis placed into the negative spaces rather than, in Western society, it's about the face or the portrait, and no one necessarily cares about what's behind or in between. And so Ma creates that sort of aspect between, so heavily draped clothing rather Ma can be used to explain the connection between space between body and cloth. So if it doesn't fit quite quite closely, there is some sort of negative space between the body and the cloth, and that can be done through drapery. And so I was playing around with this whole idea of negative space as well, in trying to cross-reference it with ideas of black bodies and them being negative spaces. I thought to create a garment that uses the fabric of traditional tailoring, but used some elements of what I had kind of come to collect together as aesthetics of African aesthetics in terms of clothing. So drape heavy, but also some sort of theories that and ideas that came to create some sort of an ideology. So around REINSTITUTE, or around the idea of being within the clothes. So for example, there's some few aspects that I kind of work with in terms of creating the garments of REINSTITUTE. It's, in today's world of low waist no waist cutting methodologies, I kind of brought up my own idea of around that a few years before I'd started my MA. And the central concept around that was using geometrics that are around African architecture, the idea of geometry within early African astrology, and also in the idea of ritual. So one of the ideas is that you don't necessarily, at a funeral or wedding, every part of the cow which is slaughtered is somewhat used. And each part has particular importance in terms of hierarchies. So you don't just cut something. So you have to appreciate that which you are cutting.
REINSTITUTE. Definitions of what qualifies as clothing or the clothed from the unclothed vary from culture to culture.
The interesting part of that, and this is where Ma is interesting, is that you find that you make a garment, particularly. So here, I made emphasis on the Ma, on the kanga line, which is from one shoulder and underneath the other one, underneath the armpit. which is a common way that cloth is worn in Africa, and which is also mentioned in Things Fall Apart by Chinua Achebe, when he mentions that the men wore their garments one over one shoulder and under the one arm. And so I decided to create a pattern structure around that area, and also in the lower half around the hip area, because the Western sort of clothing model has a lot of emphasis, puts a lot of emphasis on the waist. And so I decided to create garments that could fit, or rather that grip more around the conga line and the waist, and the hips. And so what that happens is that there's more ma in certain areas. And sometimes it's also, what I've found is that a lot of people of different sizes can wear the garments. And so in many ways this becomes, REINSTITUTE becomes democratic. And so REINSTITUTE came from there. And so in one part, how it evolved, it was looking at spaces of institutions. Rather, when I say institutions, I say spaces where suits collectively come together, like uniform. And I was looking at uniforms as well in part of my research. And so I thought that these garments could be a new uniform in a reimagined African world.
So why ZEITZ Mocha? Does this institution not occupy an infamous position in the art world and in Cape Town particularly?
Okay, I guess ZEITZ at the time, I was working for ZEITZ at the time in 2019. At the time, I was not quite part of the curatorial staff. I was part of the fashion department. And so the chief curator at the time offered a space for curatorial staff to present some ideas, to kind of, if you want to create an exhibition, it became an incubator space. So REINSTITUTE was my submission.
And like you have mentioned, I see this was rather site-specific. Would you say that this is an element of your experience in site-specific performance art?
I think it's interesting when you look at clothes and how they interact with geographies of space. And yeah, I feel like sometimes it just makes me a little bit more of a well-rounded designer. And it allows me to tell stories in a different way, and it allows me to speak to fashion and clothing in a different way, in a way that's historical as well, and in a way that interacts with its architecture, or with the architecture in the space.
So can you explain your experience with the intervention at the museum? And maybe speak through the intervention held there?
Yeah, it was cool. I was happy to be part of Michaela's group exhibition, The Main Complaint. It was interesting because I got the curatorial staff to buy into the idea. The important part was the whole museum taking part in the intervention. And so I think the truly democratic aspects of the work, which I mentioned earlier, really showed itself, where you had, the curatorial staff sharing the same exact garment with someone who works security for the building. But also the comments that I got back from some of the participants, stating that they felt regal in the garments and they felt royal. The designs kind of took them back to a space of African pride, if I have to put in that sort of word. But also that they had the chance to, take part in an art intervention, which essentially they were, I guess, in normal museum settings they would never necessarily take part in. And their sole function, particularly the security, was to either administer or to take care of the artworks, to make sure that people don't touch the artworks. In this case, people are touching the artworks. In fact, they're sweating, if I have to put in that sort of way, on the artworks.
I'm creating something with a collar, so I think would go really well with the hair, which I have to go fix now. Please don't take pictures of me. Oh my god, it's so comfortable.
Yeah, it's
Yeah, so every aspect, every facet of the staff took part, and I was grateful to the museum, and I was also grateful to Michaela for being part of that, allowing me to have that experience, but also truly grateful to also the curatorial staff for being fully supportive of the project. Yeah, that's all that comes to mind at this moment.
What is really striking for me is that the work, REINSTITUTE, has become successfully translated from academic study to commercial or popular culture, to performance art, and to site-specific interventions. So, where do you see yourself taking the project next?
Yeah, at this point, I think the interesting part is that I've been able to look at a clothing campaign from multiple different directions, or through different frames. And so now it's just trying to integrate with every part of the project. And so through looking back at the project, I looked at some of the early images that we took when we did the fittings, and some of the photos were reminiscent of anthropometric photography. And so I thought that would be interesting in terms of using that realization to interrogate collections, anthropometric collections in European museums, in terms of how Africans were photographed, in terms of how their garments were displayed, and how that can interact with ideas of design and ideas of African aesthetics in terms of clothing. So that's definitely the area that I'm taking the work in at this current moment. But you never know, things always progress.
Lastly, is there some parting words for our guests? And where can they find you or your work?
Yeah, there is. Thanks for listening to me, first of all. And yeah, if you'd like to know anything more about where to find me, you can find me on Instagram at LESIBA MABITSELA Studio, or you can find my personal account at souvenirs of conflict, so souvenirs_of_conflict on Instagram. I'm currently working on an official website again, so yeah, hopefully that will get ready in time. I've also got a newsletter, and you can access all of this via my Instagram. I've got an ongoing promotion at this point, so if you sign up to my newsletter, you also get a free copy of the digital zine for REINSTITUTE, the one that took place at ZEITZ, so you can get to see all of the information and the footage, all put into a nice little digital zine there as well. So yes, thank you for having me, and hopefully we'll speak to each other again soon.